Welcome everyone to our sixth session of Kohelet. We're at the very end of chapter 2, the last verse. We're going to go to chapter 3. But first, Nancy asked me a question about allusions to the beginning of a Torah, to Abel and to Cain and to Adam. And because we talked about this last time in our last session, I mean, it's hard to know because Ben Adam is how you say a human being in Hebrew, a child of Adam, right? So it's not an unusual, and Adam is how you say a person, but as the Midrash notes, there's many ways of saying a person in Hebrew. There's Ish, there's Gever, there's, and in later rabbinic tradition, we kind of bring a meaning for each one of those, and whole shades of meaning. But I think that the fact that it uses Adam over and over is trying to get to, we're talking about big issues. We're talking about primordial issues. We're talking about the most important questions. The whole Hevel and Cain thing is interesting, and we can never know how much of that was deliberate. But I think there's a convincing case there that, we didn't do this last time, but I think we could do this now, is go look up the word Hevel. And does it come up anywhere in all of Tanakh except for here and in the story of Hevel and Cain? I don't know. So we can go search that out, because I think that would be a really.
Can I ask you something before you
Sure,
start? I have a 12-year-old client who I've told her mother she can't let her watch TikTok anymore, but she told me that there's something she belongs to called Atheistic Satanism. That's her religion. And that Adam and Eve in the garden, you can't blame the devil for making them eat that apple. What do you say to a 12-year-old? First of all, she shouldn't be on TikTok. You're not supposed to be on until you're 13. But this is the information she's getting off of those videos.
Wait, it's the teen who's talking about Satan and everything, or is it?
Satan.
Satan wasn't there.
Well, the devil, but she says the snake. In her small 12-year-old mind, this is how she's interpreted it.
I mean, it seems to be clearly that teenager propensity to search out the dark, to explore the dark and kind of feel connected to it. It makes you feel powerful, right? It seems to me that teenagers feel a connection there, and they explore. And I'm not sure if the best approach is to kind of scare them away from it, or to kind of not notice it and let them, but I personally think it's a bad idea to try and connect to anything that dark. And
right. Well, she's been hospitalized twice in the last month for suicide ideation, so she has problems. But TikTok, I don't know how she got an app when she's only 12.
It's real easy. It's real easy.
Oh, yeah.
That easy? Yeah, well.
if she can find on TikTok, she could just Google it probably.
She's the wrong person to be on it.
Yes, yeah. All that stuff, it's really not healthy. Well, I know my wife deals with clients who are like that, and she uses the DBT method. DBT?
Yeah, I don't do that, but I know that that's a good thing. But
because it's or RODBT, but it's. I mean, I've tried a little bit to counsel a few times teenagers who have felt drawn in that direction. And
well, the other thing is that there was a study at Johns Hopkins at TikTok last year. I had a client that developed tics, and they have proved in a study of like 50,000 kids that they got the tics from watching TikTok. And her tics have now subsided this year because she's not watching it like she used to.
That is super scary. I know nothing about TikTok, but it's not. I hope it gets TikToked out of existence by the time my kids are enough to be. But there'll probably be something else. There'll be something else.
I'm sure.
It's something worse.
I mean, on the other hand, I maybe to say something before we move on is I do think that when especially girls, but boys too, when they're around that age, they experience something of a spiritual kind of, they can feel spirit suddenly more in a more intentional way than before, and for good and for not good. And sometimes I think kids who are drawn in that dark direction, it's not only because they're want to inflict harm on themselves and they're going fall into darkness, but they're also experiencing some kind of opening within themselves, and they just have to be steered towards something that's positive. I mean, I remember I mentioned this, I think, on Sunday at my meditation class, but when I was working at a Camp Ramah, my very first year, and I knew very little about how these camps worked, but I was charged with teaching a class about something, whatever, any elective for ninth graders, and I had to compete against other teachers, and they were all picking the fun and cool stuff. And I said, well, I'm going to teach them relationship with God and meditation. And everybody laughed at me and said, how could you ever teach them that? Nobody's going to pick your class. But I made a nice pitch, and by the end of and so I told them about it, and half the kids chose my class, and there were 5 other. And by the end of the summer, we were doing meditation half an hour every morning in the middle of camp. And I think, kids are looking, and kids are searching, and at that age they experience a kind of, they're more open, and if you don't provide them anything, sometimes they'll just go look in ways in places that are not super positive. But sometimes they just do it to get a thrill too, out of watching adults freak out. But
it's also just that whole flirtation with something they're not supposed to
exactly,
Ooh.
yeah.
do. I
Exactly.
mean, they're capable of doing this. It's like when I was that age, we used to have at our slumber parties, we would do that thing where you go in the bathroom with a mirror and in the
Right.
dark, and you'd say, Mary, Mary, whatever, something, and there's supposed to be some like Bloody
Exactly.
Mary coming and getting you and pulling you through the mirror or something. But I mean, it's like that fascination with something that's, is dark and bad. And,
Yeah.
I just think it's an age thing. And I think if you just
Yeah.
kind of leave it alone, they go away.
I agree with you. I mean, when I don't know if you were there, when Norma was talking, was a little bit more extreme than that, because this is someone who's been hospitalized for hurting themselves, and
Oh, this
who
is
said
true.
that they
Yeah.
were, and who talking about Satan and really going strongly in that direction. So
Yeah.
And she
anyway,
knows the difference between the house of Satan and this Satan atheism thing.
yeah, I mean, it sounds a little ridiculous, Satan atheism, but I'm not sure what that means, but maybe I don't want to know. But anyway, yeah, that's that's tough. But I do think, what Deb, what you're talking about, that's everybody, and that's, well, not almost everybody, and that's really harmless. But sometimes you do see kids who over their teenage years get a little bit too involved in all that stuff, and I'm not sure it's good for them, to explore witchcraft and things like that. Anyway,
Very
that's
scary.
a little scary, and I'm sure normally you're able to help her a lot
Oh, I hope so.
by being positive and hearing her out. And she probably, a lot of us just needs to be heard out. But
Tension.
yeah, and it's not an easy thing to deal with. So I mean, you can say the Jewish point of view, which is the Jewish point of view, which I think is much closer to the truth of the text, is that
I told her that. She doesn't like
Yeah.
that either, and she hates
Yeah.
Jesus too, she told me, so.
Okay, well, you can say that the text itself is Satan is, the snake is not Satan, but the snake represents something within all of us, which is
Right.
our not so good inclination. And so, but on the other hand, the not so good inclination is there to help us grow too, right? It's all part of the plan to help human beings grow. Because if you didn't have a not so good inclination, the world would have no movement. The world would just be boring. So so we started by answering, talking about the question of, well, where does Hevel come up? The word Hevel, Abel, come up in the Tanakh. So we see here the whole of Bereshit. Yeah. So it's basically, these are all other mentions. So no, it does come up at other places heavily, not very often. But it does come up. Yeah, it does come up. Breath does come up. So that's interesting. But I will say that the one thing that I find interesting about the whole connection of Cain and Abel and to this Kohelet is that we talk about Cain and Abel, but we don't often talk about their names. And when you read the story of Cain and Abel, it says, and Cain is called Cain because of kaniti, because of purchased. So we never really talk about that. Why is Cain's name coming from the word to purchase? What does it mean? And why is Hevel's name Hevel? Why is Hevel's name, a breath, a fleeting breath? And somehow Kohelet maybe is kind of connecting to ancient themes that we can't really feel, of the idea of purchasing versus what's really meaningful in life, or materialism versus spiritualism, or so I think there's something there that this book Kohelet might be picking up on, but we can never know for sure because the word to purchase, kaniti, Cain, is quite a common word, and the word Hevel does appear quite a lot, but it's no accident that Hevel's name is Hevel and the Cain's name comes from the purchase, and so there's good room there to at least drash on.
Thank you.
So let's go back to, anybody have any other questions or thoughts remaining from the end of the last session? Because we came to the very last line and we didn't have time to get to it, but we're going to go to it now. So we've been talking about, in the second chapter, we spent a lot of time talking about legacy and wisdom and about acquisition and about the great question of what are we all doing here and what's his, what's the purpose of life and what's he exactly trying to tell us. So let's read the last 3 verses, but we'll really focus on the last verse. Alan, do you mind reading the last 3
Sure.
verses?
Starting with, was it 24? There is nothing.
Yeah, 24. Yeah.
Okay. There is nothing worthwhile for a man but to eat and drink and afford himself enjoyment with his means. And even that, I noted, comes from God. For who eats and who enjoys but myself? To the man, namely, who pleases him, he has given the wisdom and shrewdness to enjoy himself. And to him who displeases, he has given the urge to gather and amass, only for handing on to one who is pleasing to God. That too is futile and pursuit of wind.
Thank you. So when someone pleases God, he gives them wisdom and shrewdness, and even though all of life is pursuit of wind, he gives them at least the wisdom and shrewdness to enjoy life. But to those who displeases God, he only gives the urge to keep gathering and gathering and gathering, and presumably not to be satisfied. And at the end, God just takes it all away from them and gives it to someone who God likes. What do you think of that?
Why does it say that too is futile? TOO. I mean, I feel like we've just said that maybe it's not so futile, the first man who pleases God, but the displeasing, then yeah, that is futile, but why is it also futile?
So there's a question about that by the commentators. Some people say it refers only to the second verse, second part of the verse, which is, it makes all that amassing and gathering very futile if if at the end of the day, God just ends up giving it to someone else. And so it's referring to that part. But it could be referring to the whole thing. What do you think?
I don't know. It stands out to me because it doesn't work, because I feel like he's just said everything that we've already kind of said in a way, but in a different way, or come to a conclusion of sorts. But the two just really, because it wouldn't be just even for that second part, because that he's already said that well, I guess he hasn't really said that. So.
Well, I mean, one of the ways it's interpreted, I'm just looking right now, one of the books that I'm using, but the one of the ways it's interpreted is that it's referring to everything he's been talking about, which is the pursuit of wealth. That in general, the pursuit of wealth is futile and pursuit of wind, because your legacy, even if you keep your wealth, then you don't know who you're giving it to, and they could completely squander it in few years, or but in your very lifetime, it can just be completely taken away from you, and we all know people like that who've amassed wealth and suddenly something happens and a lot of it's taken away from them somehow, or they lose a portion of it.
So maybe it's the handing on to one who is pleasing to God, that too is futile, meaning like not just the urging together and amass and not getting anything out of that, or that it just goes to waste, but also the idea that you're handing it on to someone who is pleasing to God, who will at least get some enjoyment out of it. For you, that's futile for you, because the other guy gets to have at least something out of it.
Well, and it's futile too because you don't have it anymore.
But yeah, that's what I mean.
The time
For
gathering
you,
and
it's
amassing.
futile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You lose basically. There's a decent chance you're gonna. Well, if you spend your whole life amassing it and you still have it, then you're gonna really be worried what's going to happen to it at the end of my life, and spend your last year thinking about it, and if you don't, but on the other hand, it could just be taken away from you in your very life and given to somebody else, and you never know why. Maybe it's because here's so the one of the ideas among the scholars is that this last verse was added on to kind of hedge a little bit what was said before, to at least bring God into it and say, well, at least God's behind who has the wealth and who hasn't, and that God at least, there's some order to the universe, right? Some people think it was a pious editor that added this last verse because you're right, it brings a little bit more, except for the last verse, which kind of takes it away again. But the very beginning of the verse seems to add a little bit of order to our universe, right? It says, okay, at least God is giving the people who are deserving a chance of enjoyment, and those who are not deserving takes it away. But then it kind of seems like once again at the very end, we have this gam ze hevel ureut ulach, which is hard to know exactly if it's referring only to that verse or to the whole pursuit of wealth in general, or just the second half of the verse.
I think that those three words, though, pursuit of wind. Who could catch the wind? I mean, basically, it's just saying, yeah, go ahead and try that, but you're never going to get anything out of it.
Yeah,
It's a
very
waste of
practical, isn't
time.
it? Yeah, and even it might be that a shepherd, try to shepherd the wind, right? It's so in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, Adonai Roi, right? So try and shepherd the wind. Go ahead, try and shepherd the wind. It's not going to get very far.
That
I mean,
in fact,
go ahead.
good morning. That in fact is Alter following that Roeh. He says a mere breath and hurting the wind, and so it's like we have this phrase now, herding cats.
Yeah, I was thinking.
So go try it. If you've had cats, you know how hard that is. But the wind, there it is.
Some scholars suggest, oh, you could go ahead, Phil, in a second, but
That's
some
all I had.
scholars suggest even that the pursuit of wind is not referring to a message, but to a bodily function. So even if the
Yeah.
even if the so everything is a fleeting breath and letting off wind. Yeah. So it's his scholars have fun too, right? They like to interpret.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead.
I was thinking about, for some reason, this is making me think of like ancient Egyptians.
Mhm.
The ones who were wealthy pretty much buried themselves with their wealth.
Mm.
So, they, like you said, now you said, well, you can't take it with you. Well, they did, but I think, there's a difference between, what you're thinking of what happens when you die. The Egyptians thought that, they were going to another world. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, for us, it's development of your soul. So, and so when he says, well, all this stuff is futile, it really has to do with the development of our soul, that we're, living our lives, what we do, why we do it. So I think there's, to say that it's all futile, I think is, I don't know, being very cynical.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. He's, our kind of mainstream way of looking at life with a religious, spiritual lens is to say, well, the acquisition of wealth and of material belongings is not everything, but we're working on our souls, and this world is a school, and we're here to grow and to learn. And I'm not sure that, if you were to say Kohelet, is that wrong? Even though I'm not sure what he would believe about a soul. But at this point, I think he would believe in the soul. But he's coming from a very specific place of trying to go deep, deep, deep. But what is life about? And I'm not, where I tried to grow in wisdom, but I'm not sure that the wisdom actually served me in the end. And it is a cynical place, but it's a place that leads you to a very deep place. And I think at its best, Kohelet takes us to that very deep place of really trying to understand, well, if we look at it with as powerful and as clear eyes as we can, what is all this life in this universe about, and what are we doing here? And life is a school. We're here to learn, and he's going to try and challenge that ever further, to tell you, okay, well, what are you trying to learn, and how exactly do you learn, and do you learn by just trying to become more wise, or do you learn by just living, or how do you learn? How do you learn in this life, and how do you get the most meaning out of it? But I hear you. It's easy to feel the cynicism of it, but the cynicism is a tool to try and take us deeper in my mind. Let's move on to, unless someone else had any other thoughts on the end of chapter 2. We're going to switch gears a little bit.
I had one
Sure.
thing. I see wisdom as a gift, but what about shrewdness? I don't see shrewdness that would go with wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the Hebrew actually is on that, or just this translation.
Thank you. Well, it is interesting, because shrewdness for us is not always a positive
Right.
word in English, and the Hebrew is dat, which really means knowledge in many ways, but it's often, sometimes, at least the way the rabbis translate dat is the way we would talk about it, maybe a street knowledge, kind of, not knowledge of things, but
Street smart.
street smarts. Yeah, street smarts. There you go, street smarts. So shrewdness and street smarts have some kind of linked to them, right? The shrewdness, understanding people, or having a keenness to, it's not book knowledge, it seems to be. And I think that's why. I'm not sure we had that earlier, and I'm not sure they translated it as in the same way. I just want to quickly go up. I mean, talked about this 3 weeks ago, I think, but we have da'at in Kabbalah, we have higher knowledge and lower knowledge. And lower knowledge is just da'at tachton, is knowing things, while da'at elyon, let's see. No, you see, they do use it here. You see, chapter 2 ends, this is how chapter 2 ends. To the man, namely, who pleases him, he has given the wisdom and shrewdness.
Oh,
Sorry, that's where we just were. Sorry, I'm getting confused here. Sorry. Yeah. I'm getting confused. Let's see. Because we talked about chokhmah. Here we go. So this is the end of chapter 1, where it also talks about wisdom and knowledge, or da'at. For as wisdom grows, vexation grows, to increase learning. So here they translate da'at as learning, but then afterwards they translate it as shrewdness. So you see how translations are trying to work with the word in context, and here it's translated very differently. It's the same word, chokhmah da'at, right? Chokhmah da'at, here they translate wisdom and learning. And at the end of chapter 2, it's translated as chokhmah da'at, translated as wisdom and shrewdness. Oh, so here, look, there's a note, literally wisdom and knowledge and enjoyment. Okay. Simcha. Okay. So I don't think it's meant to have a negative connotation. I think it's meant to have a positive connotation.
okay.
Was it more like clever? Which has a little.
Yeah,
positive and negative?
it's I think it's knowledge in action kind of thing, or knowledge.
I'm kind of thinking enjoyment of the wisdom.
Yeah, or maybe the wisdom to enjoy, or the enjoyment of the wisdom, or the wisdom to know when, or the knowledge to know when to enjoy wisdom, or how to enjoy wisdom. You can, because there are 3 verbs, there are 3 words, chokhmah, v'da'at, v'simcha. Chokhmah is wisdom, da'at is knowledge, or they said street smart, and simcha is enjoyment. But again, Hebrew has so many different shades of meaning, it's hard to always get to what exactly the specific shade is there. But those are all positive words. And I agree, shrewdness might not have been the best word, because shrewdness for us has a few negative connotations.
So it was just their translation of it, perhaps.
That was their translation, I think, that kind of brought up that question. Okay, let's go to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is this famous passage.
Yeah.
Who is it who sings this? I forget now. I see it in the Sefer everything.
Birds, it's the birds.
Oh, the birds, yeah.
Birds. Yeah, it's the birds. And it's very one of the parts of the Tanakh that's used a lot in liturgy, and specifically at funerals, right? The funerals, you often hear people say this, and so now we're studying it in context, and I think there are a lot of different ways of looking at what it's trying to say. So someone else, please read for us chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3.
A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns?
Okay, that's
Whoa.
the last verse kind of gives it a different spin a little bit.
Yeah, but it starts out so beautifully positive.
So what's it saying? What do people, what do you think? What's it saying? I mean, it's so powerful, just grabs you. But what's it saying? What's it saying about?
It's everything.
Everything that's in motion.
Right.
These are all things that are moving from one spot to another. And classically, generation and corruption was a part of motion. So this is every form of motion that he can imagine. The motion of the seasons, the motion between birth and death, etc. Now, it's very interesting that 400 years later, a philosopher comes and he's trying to investigate what is the source of this motion. And this is Aristotle in his physics, and he finds the source of this motion and he calls it the unmoved mover. So, you know, there's some connection here between Kohales saying that everything under the sun is in motion, everything under the sun cannot last, everything under the sun turns and twists and turns into something else, but there's something still in this whole thing. He doesn't say that, but I think that's what he's implying.
So what's the message of it then? Is the message that everything, so there's two ways of looking at this, right? Some of the commentators say, does this mean that everything is preordained? Is that what this is saying? That there is a season for everything, and therefore everything is preordained, it's in the stars, it's, you know, astrological, and then therefore everything is futile? Or is it saying something a little bit different?
I think what it's saying is that don't pay so much attention to the things under the sun that are in motion, but try and look at the source. What's moving all of this? I think that's where he's pointing to. And that's what gets taken up actually 400 years later by Greek philosophers who are interested in that. So what's moving all of this?
It's time
Well,
that we're controlled by it.
That's nice. I like that. Right.
But time or eternity, which is not really a part of time. Yeah, it's very difficult to know what's moving at all. But I think that's what he's pointing us to investigate.
So that's I like that. I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. Time is also an opportunity. An et is also an opportunity. So is also a way of looking at this. And I think this is the way that it's also often interpreted when you hear it at a funeral, which is that in our life, there's times for all of this, and therefore there's an opportunity for all of us to get in sync with the movement of all of it, right? That's somehow, when you hear at a funeral, it gives one comfort, at least in my sense, because it's telling you, right, life has its rhythms, life has its movements, and life has its times. And what do we do as human beings? We try and hold each one as best we can and find the right time for each one. And if we're in tune with it, then we're able to find the right internal approach for every one of these ets, for every one of these times, and we're able to find maybe not the joy, but to find the meaning, the understanding, the wisdom, and I think, I don't know what do others think, but when you hear a time for being born and a time for dying at a funeral, does it give you comfort, or does it?
I think it makes you think about, if you're attending a funeral, that one day your time will come.
Yeah.
I think that's just a rumor. That's just a rumor. You,
And so you better enjoy what the time that you have.
Well, you know, as a rabbi, something that happens every now and then is, you know, in the morning you're doing a baby naming, and in the evening you're doing a
Yeah.
funeral, and so it's
Right.
very literal. You experience it because you see it, you know, and it's very striking. Or that you do a bar mitzvah, and the next day you do a funeral, or you know, and you see all of it, right? And in a Jewish, one of the beauties of a community is that you become attuned to all of these movements because you live them. You know, you attend all of these, the joys and the sadnesses, and it brings meaning into life to be aware of it, and not to push any of these away.
But it's also
One
saying
com-
that you have this whole life with all these things, and in it, some of it is happiness and some of it is sadness, you know, a time for tearing down, a time for building up. So there's something wonderful and something not so wonderful. That's just life.
And
There's a,
I was just going to quickly say, and then Phil, go ahead. Also, a time is also brings you a sense that it's part of life,
Right.
but it's also I wouldn't say intentional, but it's worked into life, and there's a proper approach for everyone, right? There's a time where you tear down, and that's part of life. And there's a time of, you know, it's like that old Mishnah, and this is a whole line of, and within Judaism, but right, when you're, you know, 3 is the time of, you know, 5 is a time of Torah, and 13 is a time of mitzvot, and the age of 40 is the age of wisdom, and the age of, you know, 80 is the age of strength. And, you know, so there's times in life for everything. And we each are, you know, challenged to find our place in them. And I'm kind of channeling a different tradition, but right in I think it's the Bhagavad Gita. It says, what is wisdom? Wisdom is skill and action. It's knowing, it's having the skill to know when an act comes your way, what direction to pick, you know? So do you have the skill to know this is the moment now to build? Or are you trying to build when really it's a time for tearing down? Are you trying to tear down when really it's a time to build? And to go with the cycles of life gives one a certain ease in one's life and a power to one's life. And right, we have that in Judaism. And, you know, I think of the ultra-Orthodox communities where you study in yeshiva, and then you get married, and they're very distinct parts of life. I mean, we have them in general, but they give life meaning. And again, since we're talking about India, but in India, right, the first part of your life, they're called a different ashramas, I think. And the first part of life is a part of life where you study, and then there's a part of life where you're in the world and you contribute, and you have a family, and you bring up your family. And then you have a part of life where you're supposed to go back to the jungle, so to speak, where you're supposed to, you know, after you're an empty nester, you go back and you let go of society, and you try and find out, well, what is life about? You try and explore, what am I doing here? You try and immerse yourself in study and in self kind of knowledge, because that's the time of life that's fitting for that.
right.
Go ahead, Phil. You're about to
Yeah,
say-
no, I'm glad you mentioned that, and those stages, and also the Bhagavad Gita, because it relates to a tension, I think, in the long stretch of discussion of this text, between the passive fatalistic acceptance way of looking at it and the active, it's time. Yes, there's a time to plant. Well, is it now? Should we plant now? Should we wait till next year? Is this the time where it's going to be a drought? It'd be a waste of our effort. And a lot can ride on those decisions. So, and that's also in the course of, as I dimly recall in the history of translation, you can try to translate it so it's more a matter of choosing to do things, or there's a time when these things were going to happen to us. We've heard all those different, I think, aspects of it here. And then when you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, it's been a very long time since I read that, and believe me, only in translation. But there was a question about, very practical question, is it Arjuna? Is that whether to go to war?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, this is action in the world, and all the mayhem and all the horror that comes from that. And it's, or you could be or you could go into the forest, and when you give up all your attachments in the world, you go in, and then you become this character in the forest, a sadhu or whatever. You're just a sage, but you're remote. And here, I think it can be read all these different ways. And so you can take from this a kind of resignation, or you can take to it a kind of call to decide what to do. And if you get to verse 11, did we get that far? Because that's where 8, I'm sorry, because that's where God, he says he brings things to happen in the time. Yes, I'm looking for that.
Go ahead. Do you mind reading verse 10 and 11? Because we didn't read verse 10 and 11, but I think you're right. It's really.
Oh, okay.
I've observed I can read it. I've observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely at its time. He also puts eternity in their mind, but without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. What a beautiful verse that is. Really interesting. Do you remember what Krishna answers Arjuna in the Gita when Arjuna asks him about killing? Because he has to go to war and he has to kill his own relatives and teachers. So I believe
it's all Maya. It's all illusion.
He tells him it's all illusion. He says you have to fulfill your duty, but do it without attachment. He says go to war, but go to war without attachment.
But he's also saying that everything that he sees out there, his family, etc., are all passing forms. He's saying the same thing that Kohalas is saying. It's all sort of illusion. It's all wind. It's all passing forms. So there's no fault in killing these people because they're not really things at all.
I don't know if he would go quite that far as saying there's no fault because everything is illusion, but he would say, there are times where you have to fulfill your duty of going to war because they're attacking you and they're going to kill your family if you don't. So how do you approach being a soldier in that space? And he says you do it, but without attachment. In the sense, I mean, it's a very strong idea, but it's I think doing it with the realization of giving it up to everything, like you said, everything is illusion, but everything is full of God at the same time. I mean, in Hinduism, there's that dichotomy of everything. On one hand, everything is Maya, so everything is illusion. On the other hand, every human being contains Atman inside of them, which is part of Brahman, which is part of God. So everything is God and everything is illusion at the same time. Or the illusion is God's Leela. The illusion is God's divine play. I think that's how they.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
And so maybe if we bring that here for a second, that this is all part of the theater of life, right? This is all part of the theater of life. Or Shakespeare, all of life is a play, and each actor has many exits and entrances, and we each have to, and we each play many parts in our lives. So. I think that also links to this, but I think Phil, I like the way you put it, which is it fatalistic or is it inviting us to finding the right moment and right time for all of this? Let's look at these individually because it's interesting, I think, to hear what the tradition has to say about each of them. So I mean, the beginning one, a time for being born, a time for dying, is pretty clear, and a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted. What is a time for uprooting the planted?
Harvest.
Harvest.
Yeah, the harvest.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because it doesn't use the word for harvest. It uses the word to uproot the planted. The commentators don't say much about it, but what I had in my mind was
Exile too.
what's that say again?
could be exile, right? You plant a
Yeah.
people in a space, right? Like Moses and Joshua planted the people in the promised land, and then they were uprooted twice and into exile. So it could be that too. Could be reference.
Beautiful. Well, that's precisely what the Rashi views a lot of these in the very historical terms, and so he's saying that there's times in life when he sees it metaphorically, right? When you're planted, either as a nation or as a person, right? Where you're planted, and there's times where you have to uproot yourself, and you're on the road, so to speak. And Jews, we've been on the roads. We know what the road feels like, right? We've been on the road a lot. When we've had to, this time I was thinking about, yesterday usually we do our own fall cleanup, but we had a crew come and do fall cleanup for our yard, and they cleaned up a little bit more than we would have cleaned up. So they did the opposite of planting and took everything out over, they didn't uproot it. I mean, they just cut it down, but Rachel and I were like, well, I guess it's time for them to, I guess that was a time for it, but we like to keep our grasses long and our native stuff, but there is a time for everything.
But it can be uprooting, doesn't have to be only the way, Nancy said it. It could be like you're born into a house and then you go off to college, or you get married, or you're uprooted in that way also from your comfort zone.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's really important to be to uproot yourself, right?
Right.
You're too planted in a certain way, or in a place, or
And
in a
never
way of
leave.
yourself, or when you're inside your own, you're too rooted, planted in the same way of thinking and being, and you're like, I just can't bear every day is the same. I need to uproot myself and try something new, in my life, or
Or people who make aliyah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they might, sure.
So a time for slaying and a time for healing. So a lot of the commentators view this like Arjuna and the Gita as, there's a time where you have to slay, where you have to kill, and then there's a time when you have to heal. Though the commentators also say that these are not always perfect opposites. We want them to be opposites, but they're not always opposites, because they say killing is something that human beings do. That's a tragedy, while healing is something where we're assisting with God in. But I'm not sure that's the pshat of what's going on here. But I mean, it's one of the, it comes up a lot through all of these: a time for war, and a time for peace, a time for killing, a time. One of the hardest things is to know that, it's easy to say, well, when you have to do your duty and go to war, then you have to, but it's a very difficult thing to know when is a time for peace and when is a time for war. A lot of leaders, there's a lot of scholarship, modern scholarship, that's been critical of Churchill recently, but Churchill saying this is a time to confront the Nazis, this is a time to go to war, right? This is a time to, this is a time to face them, not to cave in. But it's a hard thing to know, right? Every political leaders have to deal with that a lot. And then we have a time for tearing down and a time for building up. What is that referring to? What do you think?
I
Sounds
mean,
like
it could
construction.
be referring to something, doing something physical. It could also be referring to doing something to someone, tear them down or build them up. And it could be even there something having to do with their physique, but it could also be having to do with their personality or mentally.
Emotions, Alan, emotions,
Emotionally.
maybe. Yeah.
Mhm. And and it happens again. Rashi, who's always looks at this historically, the time when you build up and when you tear down. he also talks about, well, the temple, right? This is when the temple was destroyed, and or the sense of when we all suffer losses of things we built have been torn down. But I like also that personal, this sometimes maybe what you were bringing up earlier, Norma, of this person, who's trying to build up something in themselves, which you're not sure is healthy. And sometimes you have to, intervene and say, I'm not sure that what you're building up here is good, in yourself, this connection to this place or this way of thinking. And
Is this the original translation? Because I remember always learning it, that it said a time to laugh and a time to cry. Is this
for
just,
the next one, yeah.
That's
Well,
the-
let's get to that. And it is a time to laugh. I know it's a time to cry is the first one. Time to cry and a
yeah, I
time.
always learned
laugh.
it the other way.
Maybe it's the
Time to
song,
What?
maybe it's how the song goes.
Yeah,
I
I think
believe
so.
The weeping comes first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's interesting, because going back to verse 3, you've got to tear down first before you can build back better, presumably, right? And it's interesting that the order of these things may not be the order that we might prefer emotionally, like first you
Right.
want to laugh, then cry, right?
Yeah.
But if you're weeping first, right? If you've got something that you're weeping over, then the laughing is much more restorative and much more joyful, rather than the reversed order. So
Well-
it appears to be deliberate.
And number five is similar too. You're throwing down the stones before
Yeah.
you gather them up and rebuild.
Mhm.
And maybe if you're talking to someone and trying to, they're down and despondent and everything just seems horrible and oh my God, life is just nothing but like birth and death. By showing them, well, sure, there's this bad stuff, but look, there's also the good stuff. So while there's time where you're feeling horrible, you will feel better because there will be these other opportunities for laughter and dancing or these good, wonderful things. So I kind of like how it's, these negative things first and then something to look forward to. Well, things are horrible now, but they're going to be great.
Yeah, but this other line is the opposite.
That's right. A time for embracing.
Embracing, that's the positive, and then it says and for shunning. So
Yeah.
that's the different from all the
Interesting.
others.
Well,
Well, let-
Unless it's-
planting and uprooting is also, right?
It is really interesting. The
Yeah,
planting,
you're right.
planting
Yeah,
comes first.
that
And then
was
the
positive
uprooting,
too. You're right.
And then,
And being
Well-
born. Yeah.
the time, the historical time for if you've just experienced your temple's been destroyed and you hear a time for tearing down, then and then a time for building up, as we were saying, maybe that's more emotionally comforting because you think, well, my building's just been torn up, but I'm reminded there will be a time that will come where I can build up again. That's comforting. And then a time for weeping. Weeping can also be catharsis, right? It can be cathartic. You weep and it makes you feel better, and it can lead you to laughing. Sometimes you just need to weep and that clears away what you're feeling, and then that leads you to laughing. But it is interesting how it does.
These things are like a pendulum, aren't they? They're going from one side to the other, from one side to the other. And the way a pendulum works is a pendulum is moored in the center. Okay, it's moored in the center. There's a spot in the pendulum that stands still. And when I read this, I somehow am, it's like a piece of music to read this. It's moving this way, it's moving that way, but there's something in the center that's standing still. And that's what I'm sort of aiming for when I'm reading this.
I like that. Well, there's a meditative quality to it. Just keep saying
Right,
to repeating the same words. So it's maybe the time is the center, right?
Right,
Because the time
right.
keeps coming back. So is the time's in the middle, and you're kind of going back and
And the
forth.
time is like the eternal now that's in the center.
Well, seems to me that that should be understood and I like that in the context of the rhetorical question, or the question anyway, in verse 9, coming after all these times. So I am looking here at altar. I'll pull back. What gain is there for him who does? That's the man of affairs, and I think in the other translation it just says "oseh," for man who does. In what he what gain is there for him who does in what he toils? And so you can have this. You might be trying to achieve the equilibrium, and eventually the pendulum will because of friction, I think, will eventually stop. But what was what was all this work for? Whether it was the tearing down or the building up, and I think it's against that question.
And with the pendulum theory, it is going back and forth. One line is positive, then negative, and the next one is negative and then positive. So.
Yeah, really interesting. It's interesting to note that how the positive is sometimes first and then the negative is sometimes first, and it's kind of like you never know with life. Sometimes
what's coming
first too. But there's a Hasidic or a mystical image that comes to mind, which is, well, what do? You know, you're always spinning in life on some level. You're going to spin a lot in life. So what do? How do you stop yourself from being thrown off? You hold on to a pole in the middle, right? If you hold on to a pole in the middle, you'll keep spinning, but at least you'll have something to hold on to that will keep you grounded, right? So what's the pole? The pole is God, or the pole is the et.
Yeah, the pole is the unmoved mover, or something like that.
But so it's interesting because this is looking at it these more in a more fatalistic way, which is all these things are going to happen to you. So what are you going to do with all of it? Well, we've also been looking at it in the active sense, which is, well, how do you find your place within each one? Deb, go ahead.
So I'm curious about the word embracing. Is that like, how is that translated? I mean, is it embracing like hugs, or is it embracing in just kind of a little bit different sense of the word?
No, it's literally a hug.
Okay.
Claudine always says to the kids, chibuk, hug. And this is the same thing as from, which comes from which, but chavok, lichavok, or mechabek. This is a hug. So, I mean, I'm not sure. It's always
because I'm
commentary. These are seen euphemistically by the tradition as times as times when a couple embraces and doesn't embrace because of purity. That's the way the tradition sees these.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so shunning is shunning also translated to be shunning, like because you're not supposed to, or
Avoiding.
Yeah, that's what it's saying, to rechok, you're distancing yourself from a hug, from embracing. I'm not sure honestly, I don't think that's what the Kohelet is referring to. I think Kohelet is referring to in more the way we read it, which is just there's a time when you embrace and a time when it's not the right time to embrace because you're having an argument, or because that's not what's needed at that moment, or
I guess because I was kind of thinking it more along the lines of embracing as being more of a containment, like a kid, you're kind of holding them in, and then they grow up and they're able to just go without the embrace, and they're able to say, no, I don't need that anymore. I can do this myself. And so I was thinking of it more as, because I'm trying to make it fit with my notion of the negative first and then the positive later. And that's been worrying me because it doesn't fit. So I'm being a rabbi about it.
The time when you want to let them bloom by themselves.
Yeah, like your kid says, I'm too old to be hugged, Mom. Stop it.
But as a recent empty nester, you're
right.
Sense, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's
that's interesting. I thought of it as when a time for embracing, when a woman is not, when she's clean, right?
That's what I'm saying. That's what the tradition is saying. Yeah, when that's what the traditions, that's what the the rabbinic tradition says this is about. And they say that the gathering stones and not gathering stones is somehow also a euphemism for having for sex. I'm not sure how they get to that with stones, but that's the way they see it. But
I can speak to that, but I won't, because I have a time for speaking and a time for silence, and this is my time for silence now. So thank you very much.
So, and speaking of a time, we're at 11:05, so it's a time to
Oh, wow.
Shut up, huh?
and-
Stop
to say
talking.
shalom.
My point.
And no meeting next week.
No meeting next week because it's Thanksgiving.
Talk turkey next.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
Oh my
There'll be a
God.
time for
Talk
turkey.
turkey.
A time for
Well-
turkey and a time for class, and next week is a time for turkey.
Rabbi, I
Rabbi.
think on my calendar, I think it says your birthday is tomorrow.
That's right.
That's true.
Happy
It's in my-
birthday,
Happy
Rabbi.
birthday.
Tomorrow.
Happy
Hey,
birthday.
Rabbi,
Have a special day.
happy birthday.
Thank you. It's a time for celebrating.
That's right.
There you go. And a time for cake.
Yeah. Time for chocolate cake.
All right.
I've had at least
wonderful day,
already
everybody.
two more desserts than I usually do over the last few days. So
Yeah.
went to Galit last night, which is very
Once a
good.
year, it's okay.
That's good.
Have a nice
Well,
day.
in 2 weeks. Have a good holiday, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Have a grateful day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.